what people find themselves attached to is the need for narratives. The reason they find themselves attached to a need for narratives is because the narrative is what they anchor their polemic in and draw the strength of their polemic from. Now, this is referring to individuals who essentially lack the capacity to reason. When an individual lacks the capacity to reason through premises, they rely on narrative power alone, which means they're looking for the basic talking points of a narrative to establish or justify their philosophy or their position. Religious narratives are a good example of this. Individuals cling to these narratives. They don't reason through anything. They just note when something contradicts the narrative, and then they defer to the premises of the narrative, believing that if they cite those premises, they have thereby provided an argument or a refutation because they are referring to a narrative that they favor or a narrative that they believe to be strong. Now, individuals are not aware that they're doing this, I think, most of the time. And as individuals progress into life, losing the capacity to reason, clinging more and more to narratives, they are drawn psychologically to narratives that then give them the capacity, the feelings that they're able to argue a strong case. They're drawn to narratives that make them feel like they have a strong polemic in the world. And they're drawn to these narratives. They find them attractive because the narrative offers this polemical power, this narrative power that they can wield against other individuals. So the allure of the narrative is precisely its polemical power, its discourse effectiveness within the context of society. But I would argue these are individuals who are incompetent in reasoning, and that's why they run to and cling to these narrative structures. This also makes individuals who do this vulnerable to narratives that appeal to their ego, to their cravings and desire for authority and power. Individuals are then looking for narratives that satisfy and meet these cravings. This choice that is made, this attachment to these narratives, is not a rational choice. It's not a deliberated choice. It is a psychological choice that is motivated by an individual's psychology. Now, I was in a conversation with an individual in relation to Hegel's philosophy of constructing essentially ethics within society, the way that ethics are essentially formed. And what Hegel states is that the process of ethical formation, in his view, it is a rational process because this process is governed by freedom. It's governed by the development of a concept of freedom, as this concept necessitates social relationships in order to bring about an actualization or a realization of this concept. So I was in a conversation with an individual, we were discussing this, and I explained to this person that this is entirely a rationalist project. And this individual didn't quite understand. They said, you're saying that this process of formulating ethics in society, duties in society, that's the context in which Hegel brings it up, that this is governed by logic. That doesn't make any sense. Well, it does make sense. But we don't think of logic right, and that's the point. Logic, when we have a concept of freedom that is determining our relations within society, we are appealing to a logical or rational concept by which to justify the function of these relationships. It's a rational justification process, because the premise that we are using to explain why we are functioning this way, why we are organizing society this way, has to do with our concepts. And concepts are constructed through reason, through logic. There's no other way to construct them or form them. I bring up this example because I'm trying to drive home the point of the authority and power of logic, of how logic resides axiomatically at the foundation of everything. In science, for example, science makes progress through a structure of concepts. Science is not merely an act of observation, it is an act of observation and concept formation based on the observation. But this is crucial because the concepts are still governing, are still ordering, are still producing what we would call knowledge. And it's important to understand this because of the point that I'm trying to get at in the totality of what I'm explaining. And that is the supremacy and the authority of logic at the foundational core. I want to drive this home with even greater force. So I've engaged in a great deal of debates with individuals, and always within these debates, what is required is a definition. One has to define their terms. And I want you to take a moment and think about this concept of definition. What is the concept of definition? We never think of the concept of definition. The concept of definition governs the entire process and activity of forming and making a dictionary. The concept of definition is foundational to the process of logic. To define something, whether we state its precise meaning, describe its basic qualities, make its outline clear, or specify it distinctly, is to identify what it is and what it is not. This act of identification is the direct application of the law of identity. It is based upon logic itself. It is logic itself which makes this process possible in the first place. Therefore, definition is not merely a linguistic procedure or matter of usage. It is a foundational logical act. The dictionary lists its surface functions, clarifying, delineating, specifying, but beneath all these lies the same operation, applying logic to draw the boundaries of a thing. What looks like language on the surface is, in its deep structure, pure logic. Identity made explicit. A definition is the premise of all reasoning involving a concept. Think about that. A definition is the premise of all reasoning involving a concept. When we construct a definition, because they do not pop out of thin air, we do not discover them in the universe, we are reasoning about what that identity of this concept should be. A definition is the premise of all reasoning involving a concept. We're trying to use as much reasoning as we can, inference as we can, to be able to state in the shortest possible space what a term actually means. If the definition fails, every argument built on it fails. That is why definitions must aim to be true, because they function as foundational premises. We turn to dictionaries as authorities in settling disputes over the meaning of words. But the construction of the meaning of words is itself a rational process. Why? What is the definition of define? The definition is that we state its precise meaning. We state something precisely. We state its meaning precisely. We describe its basic qualities. We make its outline clear. We specify it distinctly. So what I am telling you is that the act of defining is itself a logical process. Definition is itself a logical process. And perhaps even more radical than that is that definitions are in and of themselves a kind of argument, because a definition is the premise of all reasoning involving a concept. You have used reasoning to arrive at this definition. This is why definitions almost function as a kind of an argument. Since definition is the application of identity, and identity is a law of logic, the entire lexicographical process, every attempt to fix meaning, is grounded in logic. Usage may inform definitions, but logic governs them. Therefore, rationality resides at the foundation of all meaningful language. When we construct symbols, 1, 2, 3, we can only do this because we are making use of logic, precisely the law of identity. 1 is itself, 2 is itself, but 1 is not 2. 2 is not 1. If you remove this, if we banish this from the world, or think we have transcended it, we would destroy the ability to do this. 1 is not 2, 2 is not 1, 1 is itself, 2 is itself. All symbolic structures, all symbolic formations, all symbolic meaning functions on the basis of logic, including the process of definition. Now, we want to argue that all definition is merely a process of recognizing usage. It's not that usage doesn't play into the process of forming definitions, but here's the vital point. We can argue about the accuracy of definitions, and because we can argue about the accuracy of definitions, the very act and process of defining of definitions is itself a logical process. It is a process that is governed by logic. This matters because it restores reason. It restores logic into the context of definition formation. And this matters because it banishes a kind of relativism that has crept in to the process of meaning making. This doesn't mean that our process of rationally arguing about definitions is infallible, are complete, are certain, but it does mean that the process is itself logical and the process itself is rational, which means we can argue against a popular usage and say the usage is itself wrong, because the very concept of definition itself is a logical concept. Definition is based on the reality of logic. And because of that, we can say that definition A is less accurate than definition B. And this, within the context of making meaning, within the context of defining our words and clarifying things, this ability, this realization that this is a rational process makes all the difference.